All right. Figure we get that out the way.
They're starting the lesson, and they're like, "Has anybody got
Yeah, I like to get all that out the way.
You got a slide deck in that too?
Yeah, we won't be using slides today. Cool. All right. And streaming link. Cool. Let's see.
Kind of see what we all have in common, and then tomorrow too, us having those things.
Yeah. And it actually was very, we went over Monday night. Either way. And I was supposed to be coming today.
Okay. It's about that time, so we're going to get class started. There's a lot less people here today than usual. They'll be here? Okay. Cool. I was hoping everybody didn't just run away or something after JavaScript got introduced. Cool.
We all quit.
You know? So today we're going to talk a little bit more about keyframes. I'm sure you guys have a little bit of experience with that. CSS keyframe?
I've heard the term.
Really?
Has anybody else heard the term keyframe?
Oh, okay. Well, I will show you guys keyframes. Okay, so we're gonna introduce keyframes. That's what it sounds like, and then do some more jQuery today. Pretty much, we're gonna be using a lot more of the on-click events and introduce you guys to a new function called add class, where you guys can dynamically add classes to individual HTML tags. So it's going to be a lot of like JavaScript you've already seen before, so hopefully this will just be practice. The only thing that's really going to be new is going to be the animations and the keyframes. And I wasn't aware that you guys aren't familiar with keyframes, and I'm not that great with CSS, so I will try my hardest to get that across the board. First things first, do you guys still have that cheat sheet that we created last time?
Probably.
It was called JS Cheat Sheet, and I threw it in the resources channel.
I might not have downloaded it.
Cool. That's going to be pretty helpful. I'm going to see if I still find it over here. Here it is. I'll resend this URL. Copy link, repaste it. Boom. There we go. I want to walk through this one more time just to make sure that there's nothing that wasn't really fully understood with the last class. And let me turn some of this stuff down. Okay. Maybe.
So the cheat sheet that you gave us
Yes.
was just that code, right?
Yes, all the like JavaScript snippets. Cool.
Supposed to download that?
Yeah, we're supposed to just be able to keep it on hand because it has a bunch of references to things that you guys have been using a lot in JavaScript.
I saved it somewhere, just don't remember.
No worries. I just sent another link to it in the resources channel. So I want to start from the very beginning, just as a quick refresher before we hop into the exercises. One, what is a var? You want to take a stab at that for me? Exactly. It's a variable. It is a reference to a JavaScript object. It can be a reference to anything, being that it could be any object type that they have in JavaScript, your variable can refer to it. So as I showed you in this example over here, we have var x, which is assigned to a string called test. So now x is equal to the string text. Then you have, so as I mentioned earlier, we have a string object, which is denoted by double quotes. You have an integer, which is just a typical number that's not a decimal. You have a float, which is a decimal number. You have a Boolean type, which can be referenced to true or false. You would use that in your if conditionals, if you remember from last class. Then you have a JavaScript object, which is denoted by these curly brackets, and they are a key pair object. So for example, I have a var object equals key cat with the value tabby. So I can then access that value like object.cat. The key name would provide me the value tabby. Then any questions on JavaScript types? This is just a refresher, so use this as an opportunity to kind of like fill in the gaps. Object. So a JavaScript object is you can think of as just like a dictionary. It is like a mini database where you can store information. And the way you store that information is by having a key reference to that object that you want to store, which would be the value. So in this particular object that you see over here, the value that we want to store is tabby, and we're making a reference to tabby, something that we can identify, like the key cat. So you know when you go to this object and you say, give me the cat value, is going to provide you the value tabby. So for example, this could also be like so. Let's say you have like an address book. You could have I don't know, Cindy. That would be her key name, and this could be referenced to another object, and that other object could store all of Cindy's information. So like her address.
So when I enter in Cindy, it shows me all of this.
Exactly, it's going to return you this. Exactly. It's going to give you all this information that you have stored. It's just storing all the information that you want to have. Like so. Keeping in mind that value portion can be any JavaScript type. So it could be a string, it could be an integer, it could be a Boolean, it could be another object, it could even be a function. So just be aware of that.
Do you have to put the word object in front of it?
You do not. It is denoted by JavaScript knows an object by having it between these curly brackets.
Okay.
This could be a variable person equals these curly brackets.
Okay.
But remember, this is just a variable reference to this object. Then you have functions. There's three different types of writing out a function. You have an unnamed function, which is also known as an anonymous function. This would be a function that has no name, being like you can't actually reference it. You saw this primarily when you were doing on-click events, like so over here. You would just pass it in between the parentheses of the click function. But let's say this is a function that you want to reuse over and over again for multiple click functions, then you provided a name. And there's two ways to do that. You could do variable, the name of your function equals this unnamed function, or you could just provide a name within the same line of that function and just have your logic in there. This is just a way of reusing code. If it's not something you're going to reuse, then you don't need to name it. It would just be a one-time use thing. Let's see. Any questions on functions? Just functions, not events. Okay. So now we want to talk about events, which is what we'll be playing with a lot today. The primary event we're going to be talking about would be our click event. So as you saw earlier, we're going to use JavaScript. This is denoted by the $, and then within the parentheses of the $, you're going to pass in an ID, some kind of reference to the object that you want to play with. Who wants to remind me what hashtag denotes? Say it a little louder. Well, okay, so it references the ID. So if I change this to be a dot, what would that reference? Correct. And that would be a group of objects. ID for one object, dot for a group of objects. So you would get that HTML tag. Now you have the object, and now you have access to helper functions like .click. This will assign a click event to the object that you've referenced over here. So when you do .click, you pass in a function that you created earlier, whether it's a named function, whether it's an anonymous function, doesn't matter. Whatever logic is denoted by your function, it will do. So an example of that would be like our counting logic that we saw earlier. I could create a simple function over here that maybe, what's it called? That there's a global variable that I'm going to access called count, and I would just increase the count by 1, and that would increase. And every time this button is clicked, this global variable count would just increase every single time, and we did that multiple times before. So questions about events: accessing an object, referencing it, attaching a click event. All right, and that should be pretty much it. We introduced you guys to a few other helper functions like attribute, which we might talk about today, and then also the value function that gives us the value of the HTML element, which would be pretty much the text between the closing anchors of that HTML tag. So for example, if it was a p tag like so, .val would give us the value test because it's pretty much the text value between those HTML anchors. So yeah, all right. So before we hop right into class, any final questions about JavaScript? Anything that you might have seen that might have confused you before we actually begin class? Cool. All right. So the very first activity we're going to look at would be keyframes. Close this. I'm gonna demonstrate how jQuery can be used to trigger CSS animations. So for example, an example of this would be when you take a look. Actually, let's start with HTML because that's probably simpler. Let me shorten this so that they're side by side. Okay, so this is a very, very simple HTML over here. All we have is one, the reference to our CSS file, two, our script tag at the bottom of the page so that it loads after all the HTML elements on the page have loaded. We also, which is the most important bit, have a reference to jQuery because if you're not downloading jQuery to use, you don't have access to the $sign object and therefore don't have access to jQuery helper functions. So this is the most important bit. Definitely got to include the jQuery script tag. Then besides these, I'm going to separate them just for clarity. We have a div called box, and let's see where that div is over here. So box would be this entire object at the very top, which is just pretty much a black square or gray square. The CSS behind that is over here, where it's provided a box with height 100 pixels, width 100 pixels, and the background is dark gray. Pretty straightforward. So now we then have two buttons, and those two buttons are one, run around, and two, blink. And they have two individual unique IDs so that we can access them on the back end. So let's see what these buttons actually do. When I click blink, the gray square is going to flash. And then when I click run around, it's going to escape from the screen and just like run around on the page. And this is all done using CSS. That would be the CSS animation that you guys learned about previously. So the magic behind this is that there's a tag called class over here. And what we're doing when we click these buttons, you'll notice that blink class has changed. You'll notice that inside the developer tools. We're using jQuery to add the blink class to this object in real time, which then triggers the CSS that does the animation. When I click, yeah, sure. When I click blink, you're going to see blink got added to this tag, this class attribute. Remember that we have a function in jQuery called attribute, which allows us to dynamically edit attributes in real time. Same thing with run around. We're going to add the run around class, and it's going to trigger the CSS that adds an animation to this box. One more time, the class has been erased, so that means there's no animation going on right now. I'm going to click blink, and you're going to notice blink has been added to the class tag, which then triggers the animation. We're going to start with the jQuery first because that's easier for me, and I think it's the simplest part of this exercise. We're going to first get a reference to the box by calling out the ID, which would be box. As you saw earlier, this div has an ID box. That's what we're referencing. So on the back end, we're saying, hey, using jQuery, give me this box element div, and I'm going to do stuff with it. So now that we have access to box, and we're going to assign it to a variable called box so we can reuse it over and over within our code, we're now going to attach click events to the individual buttons on the screen. One for run around and two for blink. And the function for this is pretty much we're just going to use a .click on-click event, and we're going to attach a function which does box.addClass run around. That's it. This is the new function you guys will be playing around with today, add class. This is just a helper function that says whatever HTML object I'm messing with right now, which would be box over here, just add the class runaround.
Why is it run around and not run around ETN?
Because runaround is the class name. So there's
Is that from Jquery? Like, is that a thing?
no. So this is referencing the Jquery classes over here.
Oh, got it. Okay.
Yeah, well, I mean the CSS classes over here.
Okay.
So these need to already exist, is what I'm saying.
Okay.
Because it's actually the CSS that's doing the animation. The Jquery is doing no animation whatsoever. It's just saying, add this class to this object, which has this animation reference to it. So what's going on in this class name is using the animation key, and it's saying run around animation for 8 seconds, which is that movement that you saw earlier.
And that's a standard animation, run around animation?
I would assume so. It seems pretty straightforward. I can't imagine this is anything. Well, actually, no, look. This is where keyframes comes into play. So there's a keyframe over here called, yeah, so this is something you got to build by hand, because these are actually the default keys for CSS, which is transform and translate. And you're applying percentages to how much you want this object to move around the screen, and you can almost think of a keyframe like a variable in JavaScript. CSS's way of creating these reusable variables would be a keyframe, and that's what we're doing over here. We're saying attach all of this logic to a variable called runaround animation, and this runaround animation is being done for 8 seconds. That's what this is referencing.
Okay. And then you reference that on the JavaScript.
Yes, the JavaScript will just add this class name because, as you saw earlier, box has no class name.
Right. So that when you click on it, it takes that animation from CSS and
Correct.
applies it to the
Is everyone following along? I use variable because I thought that might be the simplest explanation, but a keyframe is a class. Cool. Does that make sense to everyone? You would, yes, you would do at. To denote this is a save.
Keyframes are only animated things in CSS.
It doesn't necessarily have to be animated, I don't believe, and it could be anything. Quite honestly, you could probably also even add like a background attribute over here, but we will have to Google that to confirm 100%, or maybe Dave can confirm for us. Dave, with a keyframe, are you familiar with keyframes?
No.
Okay.
You have to call a keyframe in the animation selector. So keyframes are actually a built-in CSS function.
Yep.
But it's only for animation.
Yes.
Is only for animation?
You wouldn't use a keyframe for something that wasn't changing from one state to the next.
Correct. But you could technically also like change colors within the keyframe.
Yeah, but if it's a static color, like you could change that from 0% to 100%.
Correct. Correct. Okay. So that's what I'm trying to get at. You can use other CSS attributes besides transform and translate, but as you mentioned earlier, it has to be something that that's dynamically changing. So if you're changing a color, it has to go from one percentage to the next. If like for example with gradients, you could use that. There's also like I think translate is mainly for like sizing, so you can increase the sizes, decrease the sizes, but you're going to create the entire flow and save it to a class called runaround in this particular example, which is denoted by a @keyframes key in CSS. This is you saying, I'm creating a class that's going to do this amount of animation. Does that make sense? Okay, so the JavaScript part, which is really just adding the class to Blink, you'll remember that there's multiple different ways to do the exact same thing in JavaScript, and I believe the same thing can be done like so. So as you use the attribute function before to change the href of those themes that we were changing in the previous class that I was here, we were changing the URL of those Bootstrap themes so that dynamically it would load different Bootstrap themes. This time you could do the exact same thing except for class, but there's a helper function in Jquery that makes it more user-friendly, more readable, called add class. But I just wanted to note that these two do the exact same thing. This is just cleaner and less code.
Can you put class and blank both under the one that says blank? Would you do that, or would you just do?
You would just do this, just a line 11. Because line 11 and line 12 are doing the exact same thing. You're just using two separate functions.
Line 11 only says, okay, yeah, I see what you're saying, class, except the word class. and
Exactly.
sorry,
You're defining the attribute that you want to change. Yeah, no problem. We'll be here all day to get everyone's aha moments. So that's what the buttons are doing. We're just adding classes and removing classes. But we haven't talked about how the classes are actually removed, because these two functions over here are just adding classes. And if we don't remove them, you're going to now have duplicate classes being added to your div box over and over again, and that's going to, no CSS is going to be triggered because it is only going to be looking for one class name, not triple blinks. The way we're removing those class names is there's a special function, well, there's a special event called animation end. So we used the click event earlier to add an on-click event to the box, but we're using a jQuery helper function as like add class as a helper function. We can do the exact same thing for adding an special event to the box by using .on. So on line 18, we're saying for this box on animation end, do this function. And you could think of this, you could think of our on-click events exactly the same way. Like we're going to do, let's see, I'm going to copy and paste this and do on, click, there we go. These two lines do the exact same thing. It's just that in jQuery, there's a helper function to make it look cleaner. You don't have to use .on. You can just do .click, but it does the exact same thing. Same thing. That's the exact same thing we saw with attribute, where we're defining the attribute that we want to change, but there's a helper function called add class, so it simplifies things. Don't get too confused when you see this on function. The on function is just denoting that there is no helper function in jQuery, at least as far as we are aware right now, that does animation end. So we're just going to call animation end manually because we're aware that there is an event called animation end, and we're going to attach a function to that object. So we're saying when the runaround ends, or when the blinking has ended, get that same box object, and for the attribute class, remove whatever is in there. Questions?
I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain the animation end thing, the box.com animation end?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. So in jQuery, there's we know that there's multiple events that you can play around with. One of the events we're playing around with the most is click events. In this particular scenario, we're going to take advantage of an event called animation end, and this is a listener that looks for an animation key from CSS, which is going to trigger, and they all have duration. So this duration is 8 seconds. This duration over here is, I guess, 0.3 seconds for 10 seconds. Well, 10 times. But as soon as that animation has ended, we want it to trigger and then do this amount of work.
And it's done on because it's also, that's also like a thing that comes with jQuery.
Yes, the on function you use to assign an event to an object. We were using .click, which does exactly the same as on, because for speed and because we know there's a helper function in JavaScript that does that. But if you're not aware of a box.animation end, and then this function over here, then you would just manually pass in the event that you're trying to attach to the object. So it's just a more verbose way of doing the exact same thing. That's why I had these two examples over here. These two examples, one does .click, one does .on, passing in the event that we want to attach. Same thing. Deep size
Right now,
was.
are you telling it to do it twice because you have it there 2 different times?
Yeah, so this would be erroneous. We don't need to do this.
No, I know. But
Yeah.
I'm saying, like, if you had it on there, it would go through the cycle one time, go through it again until the 2 times, and then animation end.
Let's see what happens. I'm not actually sure. Let's see. When in doubt, just try it out. Doesn't hurt. That's what you're guessing? All right, let's add some breakpoints over here. Let's refresh the page just to be sure. All right, so we're going to click run around. It's going to hit that first on-click event. Oh, wait a second. I used the wrong one. Okay, let's not go there. These are the two we care about, the two blink on-click events. So let's try that one more time. When I click blink, it hits that very first function, and then it hits the second one. But let's actually look at the HTML and see what happens. Let me remove these. I don't care about this anymore. So what we're seeing is that it hit those two on-click events, but it didn't actually duplicate the blink value. I'm curious to see what happens when we remove the animation end function that removes the class name. As you can see, the class name is now null and void. So let's refresh the page. So when we hit blink, it's going to add the blink class, but the class is going to remain blink because we haven't removed it. That animation end event never got triggered because we commented it out over here. It did stop because the animation has ended, but the additional work of removing that class name, which is denoted by this on-click event over here, this never got triggered because I commented it out.
So even if you were to hit run around, it won't swap it in over again?
Well, let's see what happens. I'll click run around. Now it's going to add the class name run around, but it didn't actually do anything. Our animation is broken. Yeah, our CSS is now broken. It would have to refer to blink and the runaround class name for it to be triggered. Let's hit blink again. Whoops. Did this just freeze? Well, I guess it freezing is a good indication that you shouldn't be doing that, but let's see. Let me refresh this page one more time. Okay, so we're going to hit blink the first time. We're going to hit blink again. Blink again. Let's take a look at that element. Yep. It doesn't actually duplicate the class, but it leaves blink there because we haven't actually removed it using the animation end event. So questions on what you've seen so far before we move on, because we're actually going to move on to an activity, and I'm curious to see if we ask you guys to build out those keyframes. We do. How much animation did you guys do since I've been? Okay. Dave, how good are you with animation? Okay. All right.
What about Lane?
So,
Lane has got keyframes. Can you teach us? Alex?
well, for this one exercise, let's just take a look at what they're asking us. So, for this particular one, let's open up this HTML file. This HTML file asks us to take a square box that we saw previously, is going to move down the screen, and it's going to fade.
It doesn't stop, you only do it one time.
Correct. Because there's no animation end event to remove the class. So actually that's a pretty good point. I want to make sure everyone in the class is aware of that. We have this box over here with the class fade down. When we refresh the page, it has no class. When we click the button fade down, it adds the fade down class, and the box is going to come back up.
But it doesn't remove it.
It doesn't remove it. So when we click the button again, it can't add anything new. It can't trigger any new events. And so the box just stays there. For this to be something you want to trigger over and over again, you have to remove that class name on animation end for this box object. So that should at least help you guys when you're trying to debug why things aren't working. So as we saw earlier, we have a div box, and then we have a button called fade down button with the text fades down. And the CSS I saw earlier for this particular box, we have some basic height and width and background keys. And then the fade down animation itself refers to a keyframe called fade down keyframe, and it does this for 2 seconds. The keyframe fade down So 100%, it has a 100% signifier with an object that relates to opacity being 0 and the transformation on the y-axis being 500 pixels. Even with my limited CSS experience, I can tell that the y-axis goes up and down, and that for 500 pixels, it's moving down 500 pixels. Correct? Question? We're going to get to that because I'm going to have to Google that. But I'm starting with the stuff that I recognize. And so my assumption would be that on this object, when you click fade down, it's going to move down 500 pixels. And this opacity means that this is the level that it's going down to. So it's starting at 100%, going all the way down to 0.
Here they don't put percent after opacity.
Yeah. I'm not 100% sure about that, but we can Google that right now and figure it out. This is all being a developer is all about. Seeing stuff that's new, you don't recognize, going to Google and figuring it out. And trying to understand what you see. Because clearly, from this object, we can tell that 1, opacity is going down to 0. It's disappearing at the end. That's one signifier. 2, it's going down the screen. It's not going across the screen. It's not going diagonally. So we know that in CSS, well, I guess in basic math, there's an x-axis and there's a y-axis, and this is going all the way down. And that's what this is pertaining to, along with the transformation key. But we need to Google what all of that stuff is. So let's see, CSS animations. And you guys should Google this along with me, because we're all going to have to learn this together. So CSS animations transform. I'm going to click this very first link. I'll just breeze through this just to make sure this is not showing us any nonsense. Nah, this is nonsense. Let's look for something really simple. One thing to be aware of, if you don't immediately see simple examples, move on. Let's see, change several properties with blah 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 blah. Okay. Let's try this. Try it yourself. Okay, yeah, I'm going to Slack out this link over here in resources. There's W3 schools. Can't go wrong with W3 schools. I scrolled down to the section that says change several properties, property values. I see that they're working with a div, and they're trying to transition that div width by 2 seconds and height by 4 seconds. Not exactly sure what that does, but we'll see in a second. So when I click try it and I hit run, what's that doing? Okay, it's increasing the width and increasing the height for 2 well, the width for 2 seconds and the height for 4 seconds. Hence why it gets longer than it gets wider.
I think we saw this. I think we actually did it in practice.
Okay, cool. Well, not cool, but yeah.
Did we do this in practice? Yeah.
Okay. So y'all are saying you've never seen animations before? You guys have seen this before?
Maybe it's been 2
That's why we don't remember.
Okay. Yeah, because I could have sworn you guys had seen animations before.
I guess we just like keyframe things.
The keyframe thing is throwing you guys off. I get it. But we'll start with the basics and get right back to keyframes. So, and I'm curious whether this is actually necessary. Let's hit run. Okay. So keeping things very simple, we have a transition that increases the width for 2 seconds and the height for 4 seconds. And for this particular scenario, using CSS, we're adding a hover event for CSS. I don't think you guys have touched that yet. You have talked about hover events? Okay, good. So that's just saying for this particular div, well, this is saying for all divs, if the mouse hovers over it, is going to increase, I believe, the width up to...
No, it's starting at 300. No, it's starting 100 by 100. Right.
Yeah, it's increasing it.
Up to 300, I guess?
Yeah, I guess it's 300 on all sides. Let's find out. Yeah, there we go. Cool. So, but the speed in which it gets to that 300 pixels is determined by this transition animation. So if I increase this to 10 seconds, I'm very curious to see what happens. Let's hit run. And are you guys following along?
Not on my computer, but here.
I see. Okay, I'm going to hover over this div, and you see it's not going to go a lot slower. But it's going to eventually hit that max cap of 300 pixels, but using the animation seconds, we're determining how quickly it gets to that point. Now let's try something more interesting, where we're playing with the translate and transformation keys. So I'm very curious to see how this works. This might be incorrect, but we'll learn by error. Okay, so now I'm going to hit run. That's already going to start it over there. Okay, that's not what I want. Let's move this to when the hover is actually triggered. Hit run. It's going to start over there. Oh, wow. Okay. Huh. Wait a second. Let me see if I add transformation over here with, well, does transformation take seconds?
So when you transition, you just need to add transform, because you have 10 seconds.
Ah, I see. So move this over here. Okay, we'll try it out. See what happens. No problem. It's okay to be wrong over here. There we go. Look at that. So now we have a transformation that slowly moves the box across the screen as we're hovering on the square. We're going to also now see what happens when we add opacity. And you guys really should be following along, because this is going to be in the exercise. You're going to recode all this stuff. So I would love for you to practice along with us. So now we're going to add opacity, because I'm learning as well, because I haven't touched CSS in many years. Let's add this over here. We'll take opacity down to 0, and then add a transformation of seconds to that opacity. Let's say, also add 10 seconds to it. So let's hit run. There we go. And now the opacity is going down to 0 slowly in 10 seconds. Is everyone understanding things so far?
Why is this in HTML?
Oh, this is just for speed. We threw it in the style tag in HTML, and we're just doing it there in W3 Schools. So don't forget that just because you've written all your CSS in a separate class does not mean that in your HTML itself you can have a style link and then write raw HTML right here. You can do all of the CSS that you're doing in your file right here in your HTML page.
So why do we have a file for CSS?
Because it's just cleaner. You don't want to have an HTML file chock full of CSS and then JavaScript and all that. It just gets very clunky. So we're just doing a separation of concerns by having a link tag that links to our CSS file.
And style in HTML, is it also considered CSS, or that's just style?
That's all CSS. Yeah. Yep, that's inline CSS. Well, not inline per se, but it's a CSS you'll be using on that HTML page. So for this exercise, we saw that they reduced opacity down to 0. They transformed the object to move across the y-axis, which is down 500 pixels. We were able to duplicate this using W3 Schools over here. And then we saw that with the transition key over here, that's kind of like playing the same role as this animation key that we see over here. So you can think of this animation key as this transition, where we're saying for this particular keyframe, which does a host of transformations, you're going to do this in like 2 seconds. That's this transition key over here. I'm trying to do a correlation so that we're aware of what's going on in these keyframes. That's how we're going to learn. We're going to take a very simple example that we found on W3 Schools and relate it to this more complicated concept of keyframes in our exercise. So now we understand what opacity does. Now we understand what transformation across the y-axis, which is moving that box across the y-axis. We have seen the transitions by seconds, that this animation key some way, somehow is related to the transition key over here, where we're able to say for these individual pieces that were animating, whether it's width, height, transform, or opacity, we're adding a duration to it. But since all of that is being bundled, you can think of a keyframe as bundling all these different animations. This whole bundle of animation happens in 2 seconds. So technically, I could have bundled all of these elements into a keyframe and just added one duration of 10 seconds for all of them. Is that making sense? You look a little lost. What's up? Okay. Well, we'll practice it. The only thing that doesn't make sense to me is this 100% signifier. So let's Google and figure out what that means. And
That means that it goes from 100% to whatever is defined below. Yeah.
so let's look at the previous example that we saw earlier. And you guys should have all these activities. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense too. So this is the animation it does 100% of the time.
Or like for the first 10%.
Yeah. You're right. So let me actually break this down by actually doing a different example. I'm going to have 50% opacity to 0, and then I'm going to have 50% opacity back to 100, and we're going to go right back up the y-axis. What this...
Is it starting at? It's like the time, so it's like at 0%. It's sequential.
Whoops.
You can't do. It's not like 50-50.
It's not 50-50?
It's not, but it's 0. Yeah.
So I have to start at 0,
So it's 0
get to 50.
And then 50 to 100, so you put 50 and then 100.
Well, it's 0 if you don't put anything. It defaults to where the current item is.
Okay.
And what the 50% is of the time duration that you put in the animation property. So
Oh.
it's 50% of 10 seconds.
Okay.
At 5 seconds, you're going to have that. At 0 seconds, you're going to have that.
I see. I see.
At 10 seconds.
Okay, so I could say do this 50% of the time, and then at 100% do that. Okay, let's try it out. Let's see what happens.
It's weird that it uses percentages.
All right. So our hypothesis is that 50% of the time of 10 seconds that we defined over here is going to do opacity to 0 and then move the box down that y-axis 500 pixels. And then as it reaches the 10-second mark, is going to increase the opacity back to 100 and then move the box back up to the starting point. So let's see. Yeah. Let's clap for us. We figured it out. So, who wants to explain what we just discovered? I don't want to explain what we just discovered because I've been explaining things all day. You want to take a stab since you're really good at explaining it before?
Yeah, sure. So keyframes, it's just like flipbook animations. So like making a flipbook, literally. Yeah.
A real flip book.
Right,
Yeah,
a real
no.
flipbook. So the concept of keyframes comes from like traditional drawing animation. And what they do is they actually have like your starting point and end point, you animate everything in between. And so the animation property in CSS requires a time value. And so keyframes is basically interpreting everything in between 0, where it's starting, and then 50% and 90%. And that's going to change based on the time value that you put in the animation rule.
Cool. So just to continue to reiterate, so everyone is aware, keyframes is going to be a bundle of animations. You could think of like, what's the term for that? Place in time animations. That's how you can break it up. So what we did was saying, we have an animation that's going to go on for 10 seconds. We know that. But during those 10 seconds, it's going to do different things. So from 0 to 5 seconds, it's going to do a block of animation, and at 5 to 10 seconds, it's going to do another block. That's how we're breaking it up over here. This keyframe allows us to do place in time animation. So we're saying from 0 to 50% of 10 seconds, this box is going to decrease opacity down to 0%. That's where the box disappears. and then we're going to move it down the screen 500 pixels. Then from 5 to 10 seconds, we're going to increase opacity right back up to 100, and we're going to move the box back to the starting point, which is going to be
5 to 10 seconds.
because these are percentages of the duration.
Are those the only ways to illustrate that?
At least right now in this particular example, yes.
You would never put something that said like 1s to 5s, 0s to 5s. Like we're saying 50% of
Yes.
that 10 seconds.
Correct.
Now that's 5 seconds.
Yes.
Is that like you know make sure that before there were 2 positions that function?
Oh, okay.
I'm asking if there's another way to illustrate that.
Not that I'm aware of. In our very simple W3 schools example, it seems like this is a more verbose way of doing transitions. You have to say for each individual animation, this is the seconds you want to use. But keyframes allows you to bundle them up together and then break them up in the duration time. If you want to bundle up animations, use keyframes. If you want to do something more simple, like what we did in W3 schools, we might only use maybe like only a few attributes, then you could probably just knock it out using this syntax.
If you do more than one animation on one object, do you duplicate that and change it to
Yeah, so the nice thing about keyframes is that now it has a name. It's a named keyframe. So if you have multiple objects that do the same animation, you can use that exact same keyframe name over and over again, fade down again, with different class names with the exact same thing. You're just assigning it a name that you can reuse. That's one of the powerful things that keyframes provides you. Kind of like a named function. You can reuse all of that logic over and over again in your Jquery.
what if they want a different animation for the second one?
For the second one, then you need a different keyframe.
You do keyframe again or keyframe 2?
You can name it whatever you want. It could be Emmanuel's animation, doesn't really matter. You just throw that name over here and call it a day, and then change up the logic that you have over here. Cool. So for this exercise, we're actually going to do things a little differently, and we're going to start with the solve section because you already have the code. I want us to play around with code that we already recognize because the next exercise, you're going to build this out yourself. So we're going to take this square. If you open up your exercise number 2 in the solved folder, we're going to play around with these elements over here. Well, mainly the CSS. What I want you guys to do is be creative, not this page, over here. Be creative. Let's add some different animation to this box. Let's maybe turn it from gray to red. Maybe
We're at exercise 2, you said?
we're on exercise 2. Maybe we're going to get the box to move across the x-axis. Maybe we're going to get the box to move diagonally. We're going to spend 25 minutes on this, and I want you guys to be able to use Google because to find out what are your options, what are the options available to you for transformations and animations. That's all we care about right now. Don't think about the Jquery. Don't think about the HTML. Think strictly about this keyframe that you want to edit. And what you're going to have right now is going to be this, where it says for 100% of the 2 seconds that was here earlier, you're going to do all of this work. But I want you guys to practice increasing this duration to maybe 10 or 20 seconds, and then doing that place and time animations that we saw earlier, where you break that 10 seconds or 20 seconds into different chunks. I broke it up into 2. I'm going to leave this up as an example, but maybe you can break it up into like, I don't know, 25% and 75%, and do different animations for this box. That's what we're going to do for the next 25 minutes. So questions on what needs to be done. Exercise 2, solved section, focusing on the CSS, playing around with keyframes specifically, and Googling to see what other options are available to you to animate this box. This is just another resource that you can also play around with at the top. Scroll down yeah, so you can probably even use like background color, change the color of the box, like I did over there. Like at 25%, turn the background to red. Do all sorts of stuff. First thing to keep in mind for the percentages, they only go up 7%. And you need the smaller numbers at the top to reach the so you have to there you go. So this will be something that's triggered as an exposed. Oh, nice. So,
No, I just there. I'm just looking at it, see if I can apply it.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, all of those attributes listed by designer CSS file.
But it wouldn't, I wouldn't be able to jump it into the keyframe, right?
Well, these are keyframes. Yeah, all of these are keyframes. This is showing you. Okay. Nice. You can try to get it
I
across.
gave it something, yeah, I gave it,
Yeah, you give it a CSS key.
so I was trying to change the background of blue, and it went back up, and it didn't because my background's already blue.
Oh, okay. So here's something else to keep in mind. So something that I've been seeing, just to make sure that I reiterate, let me actually click on the resource that Cicero slacked out earlier. If you look at this W3 schools example, you'll notice that the 0% is always at the top and the 100% is always at the bottom. These are going to be triggered from top to bottom. So from the very beginning of the duration to the very end, your numbers need to be in decreasing fashion. If it's all muddled in the beginning, you won't see the behavior that you're looking for. So just a heads up in case things are messing up.
source is this one thing. Color. Okay. But you know I'm going to break it up into different percentages.
JavaScript started.
Don't even worry about that.
I have to.
Because usually you would, right? You would add that JavaScript example to some exercise, right? And remove the class name. But for now, we'll just focus on like playing around with CSS, seeing what options are available. Yeah, no problem. Anytime you guys know. We'll see the next semester.
Yeah, I started.
Cool. So, is this like the last of the course?
I think so. I'm gonna look through the next, a couple of decks.
Okay.
Just make sure there's nothing else. But I'll let you know for sure. Thank you.
So, wow. It's cool.
You see?
Yeah. How are you guys
But
doing?
it'll work in CSS. Well, yeah. If you hit refresh, it works.
Oh yeah, that's fine.
I mean, just the bottom doesn't work as we deactivated
Oh, you guys got rid
JavaScript.
of it?
Well, we just commented it just to see how CSS
Oh, I
is
see,
working.
I see. Got it.
So now I'm guessing if I just
Yeah, so you're gonna add back in the
now would I change everything when I click on?
No, that was correct.
That was correct?
So you have a handle fade down click function and you're assigning it to the on click event. Yeah, that's perfect.
Well, this guy, I don't think it's after connection.
Yeah, that was good.
Don't worry. Yeah. You added all those questions.
Is that because, oh, okay, let's go to your HTML. This still has the class name on it. Let's get rid of that class name for the box.
This class name?
For the box? Yeah, because you're going to add it in JavaScript.
That's true, so we just do what that?
Yeah, so let's
Do
say
we
that.
do that?
No, just no value in there. You can actually remove the entire attribute
Oh, yeah.
to make it cleaner. Yeah.
Okay. So how does that know that I'm out?
Because it opened right now.
Exactly. Yep.
Box.
That's
Yeah. He said resources.
cool.
Oh,
Good stuff. All right. We'll do this for another 10 minutes. So definitely Google up interesting animations. Use this as an opportunity to try some really cool stuff because the next exercise will be less cool. So heads up. Yeah, sure.
Okay, sorry. So I think they just explained it. This is where we told the spot to do that on class. Like I was trying to add like a hover function. I need to add that on here too.
Oh, yeah, hover would be CSS.
So I started doing this here. How do I tell it to do that?
Oh, so in CSS you want to okay, let's do this in JavaScript because that's what I want to do. So you can add the on mouse over
Oh, okay.
and then you can add some class.
Gotcha. Okay, I'll try that. Cool.
I think that's what
Since we have 9 more minutes, and if some of you guys are bored and looking for, oh, what other animation can I come up with next? This will be the next exercise that we're working on. We're going to get this box to turn into a ball. So you might want to start Googling, how can I round this box out? Because you're going to have to do that from scratch. So if you want to get a, yeah, so we want to turn that box that we start off with into a ball. Maybe, I don't know. Google it.
Jesus. Well, you said Google it. I did.
Oh, you wrote this.
I'm sorry, did I just cut you out? That's really funny.
I didn't do that back when the it's get the other something. Then going back to that square. Percentage transition into the order.
So just like how you do
Whichever percentage you want to change. Did you put yours in both? First one?
Always a good sign. Always a good sign. That I did that. And then he was laughing.
I got you.
So raise your hands if you're pretty much done with playing around with animations and want to move on. Raise them a little higher so I can see them. All right. Perfect. So for this next exercise, this would be exercise 3. Actually, let me close this so I don't get confused. Exercise 3, we're going to work on the unsolved section. So let's close this, close that, close this. Don't save. If you open up exercise 3, unsolved, we have an exercise to take this square box, and when we click ball roll, it collapses the edgy parts of this box and turns it into a ball, moves it across the y-axis. We already know that's a transform on the y-axis, well, on the x-axis, my mistake. And that another thing to keep in mind is that, well, with this particular example, when we click ball roll again, it doesn't reactivate the animation. I want us to activate the animation. So you're going to steal that snippet of code from exercise 1, where on animation end, it removes the class name so that when we click this button multiple times, we can trigger it multiple times and not have to refresh the page all the time, because that's annoying and it's not good for user experience, which is what this class is all about. So let's see what we give you in the unsolved section. When I open up the unsolved HTML, we give you a button and we give you a box. Immediately we know that this box has been populated by CSS because we don't see any CSS in our HTML file. Let's look at the unsolved CSS. We're providing a basic box that we've been playing around this whole time. 100 pixels, the background, that's gray. And then we know that there's a ball roll class name that we're going to add to our box dynamically. And then the animation key references a keyframe that goes on for 5 seconds. But what's missing over here? The keyframe is making a reference to a keyframe that does not exist. Use your exercise 2 example as a reference to create a keyframe over here. Don't forget, we want to use the keyframe @ symbol to define this keyframe. But that is missing. You guys will build that from scratch. And then the JavaScript, we also give you no JavaScript, but we give you a helper text that tells you we need a reference to the box element. We need that box element reference. What's it called? We also need a onClick event to the button, and that onClick event will attach the class name that we have inside our CSS over here called ball roll. That ball roll will trigger an animation called roll animation keyframe, and that keyframe is what does not exist. So we will do this for the next 20 minutes, and then we'll move on to the next exercise. You guys have all the tools you need to get this done. Use exercise 2 heavily as a reference, and then also steal the snippet of code from exercise 1, the JavaScript file, that on animation end changes the attribute class to nothing, to empty string. This is what will allow us to trigger that animation over and over again when we click the button. So, and that piece of code is right here. you have to refresh the page and then click the button again. Technically, it could work without JavaScript because you could add a CSS hover event to that particular object by its ID, and then when you hover over it with your mouse, it would trigger the animation. The JavaScript is just another way to do the exact same thing. Before, I don't think you could do hover events using CSS, and now as time has progressed, you can do that, so now you have an option. So if you're good with JavaScript, you can do it that way. If you're good with CSS, you can do it that way. Yeah, because when I used to do a lot of CSS, there was none of this fancy stuff, so yeah. It just keeps evolving. Hey. Wow.
Yeah, I make quite an entrance nowadays. I swear, she's not gonna hear anything.
Oh, that's just nice.
We don't know what that word means, but
What?
oh, you know, like what is that?
I didn't hear it, I see.
Oh, wait, there you go. It was exactly once. No, that's fine. What is that?
Far away from what you're doing right now. I don't know what tutorials you're looking
That's the wrong one. You're so close. I threw you the alley-oop. That's very similar solution. Because on our example, our button instead is called ball roll. So we're going to use the same service. Just grab the ID for that ball roll button, right? And then use this one. You gotta close the brackets on your roll animation. So you just have to write one more. That's 100%.
Oh, so there's one more? I think I deleted it because I thought I had too many, sorry. But then, that didn't work either.
It's
You need to add a class name to the ball roll class. Okay, so over here.
Yeah, so now you have a div that has no class. So if it has no class, you can actually do the animation.
Okay, so this is my div. Do I type it in after box?
No, because, well, actually, let's just test your animation just to make sure it's doing what you want. So let's add that class name. So, add space.
No, I don't want to encode UI.
Oh, no. So we do this the same way we add a class.
I was like, I think we'll just let visual code and type
Open quotes. And then let's use the class name.
Roll animation.
Because that's the class name.
Okay.
Well, then we're going
I'm still getting all of that confusion.
It's like not even,
Changing the name of those.
That was what we did.
Should we pay you a pizza or something?
So even without clicking,
So it did.
you'll see that it's done something. But this is just refresh the page.
Yeah, it actually, yeah.
It's doing the class name. You don't want that. You want that animation.
Oh, yes.
That's where JavaScript comes in. I want to use that add class to attach that class to this object. So you'll remove the string and add the string. Just like we did the next one.
Oh, you did attributes.
Correct.
Oh, sorry, in the fade. I don't remember the name of the fade.
Yeah.
I mean, for in the Joe.
Let's do exercise 2, solve JavaScript. That's it.
But it's fade.
Yeah, fake JavaScript. That's all. That's what's in there. You know, you have a reference to
No, we just
button.
doing
Oh, like that. Okay.
That's
Yeah.
why I kept doing the empty every word.
Use this as a bullet point, but do it in long press. But don't forget to remove the class.
Is that also that?
Okay, and I
That
don't
is kind of
have.
like this.
Okay.
I do have. I was wondering if this was in there. I'll just double check.
Yeah, no problem. Are you looking here? Okay, cool. Perfect. Oh, is it, you want to use that stuff. So you want to get a reference to the box. This is just what you did when you have the box object. So add the animation. Okay. Okay, but also.
Why is it not rolling?
Oh, because you're really funny.
you did it, you did the animation, and then
So you define that first,
open the page and then click the button.
and then you put it's for you did say it's an
Yeah.
delete one of them.
Did it on the wrong thing.
That's
I animated the button. Yeah, like click the button and the button starts to do.
No.
10 more minutes and then we'll move on.
Yes, it's actually. Yeah. It's more of what code.
So like I went to like it's first reminder.
Exactly.
And yeah,
That's why.
I didn't put it where this thing put it. It automatically. So where I save that's save I created
Yeah.
another place.
Cool.
So where did I put it in
So let's look at the Josh. So right now we're missing the events each added on animation. She moves classified and that's what's really so you need a reference to box. And then one box on the animation for the actual class. So you really just click the button and make sure that this is
Yeah.
So use this here. Copy that code over there.
Yeah, now it keeps
That's
my memory stuff.
sorry.
Little bit, and it's still legal that one, but not like my hair with
That friend who just traded that flip flops and made me I spent for ankle, tore a bunch of stuff, and then fractured bone in the process of falling.
Okay.
She just had surgery on the day for it.
Well, I can't tell because it's a circle. But let's look at your JavaScript.
trying to,
Does it
and
trigger
that's
anything?
auto and on the valid.
Yes. Cool.
One whole, I feel like we're gonna have something out. So like, I'm like, live right there, okay, thank you, that's terrible. Like, sorry, awful, so like, now that I'm home, I'm like, finally settled. Alright, here, clock the timer, for 6 weeks. Good as new, yeah.
Yeah, I guess it's something like that.
Which
Is
is
that a
all
selfie?
this guy. This guy.
Oh, right in the back?
Yeah.
So, great.
Not in the front, it's just big back if I saw it.
But it's the purpley black stuff down there.
Oh, and the G was like right.
It just feels like it's without the boot on, it's just like a weight shirt. That's brutal, I know. Transform. Exert my inner heart.
Still gotta go size. You can upgrade it. And so you can have like yeah.
Alright, I'm gonna go there.
When? That's okay, it's okay, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Wait, what do you mean? Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I'm just gonna try to,
So how did internet? Yeah. That's all. For 28,000.
28,000 items. That's the big number right there.
Everything I've ever done.
Yeah.
That's still a lot.
If you don't use it, then just delete it. Delete the whole thing.
I guess not.
I mean,
Like it expires after. That's a lot of items.
that should clear up enough space in your hard drive.
To do a lot. Yeah.
Because right now, I think your hard drive is so that's why
Yeah.
that happened.
Sounds right.
That makes sense.
It's what happened. It happened to me when I put my hard drive on.
I like this too. It's the same color. I did the job scope, I fixed my button system.
Oh, yeah.
I would be open to this code, it just depends on what I mean, just like, formally, that's where, because the other one looks kind of like,
Yeah.
not necessarily standard, but like, I just feel like you got your, you know what I mean?
Sarah, that's Sarah.
Come around. This is kind of very much. What is this?
Oh yeah.
Gonna hold on to this until I find it. Oh, it's okay. Just hold it. Yes. I just figured I had to try that.
I mean, it is a letter opener right now.
2 more minutes and then we'll move on.
Yeah, that's like.
I did that once.
Well, actually, 2 more minutes and then we'll take a 10-minute break. So let's do that instead. So we'll start class back up at 8:15. So if you need a break, take it. We'll start working at 8:15.
Sure.
So exciting.
Yeah.
But if I can just walk.
So it's obvious, like when it gets purpose.
So here I'm just saying that.
Yeah.
Halfway, and then you start to stretching that space.
I'm just defining. Here I've
All
said.
the way, then you can't like hit it on the
I
inside.
made up a name called Paul.
So you see the champions. I forget what
It
it
was
is.
already. Okay, so this
Good
is.
time, we have keyframes, so that might be-
So then I said.
You know how we've done like this just buttons?
But there is
That's
an
kind of
idea
bad.
that I think.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's not actually that big. That's yeah. But both rely on you can animate a button. It just doesn't like a lot. It's like
I want you to add all
it's basically these.
Right. This is exactly your
So where, and then in my CSS is where I define what all those was using. Right, but that is what happens when I have that on the ground, so I put that, so do all of this. And then here I said, right, okay, so this means, alright, so this is also this is the on.
So remember how I said there's two ways to do it?
Yes.
One is the dot and click, and you just pass it function, which is the shorter way. The shorter way, when it's a long way, we're just saying the dot. You're using the on function and saying, or the click event, you could do this and
So I have it twice.
yeah, so you could technically it's just so it's
It's all,
So,
I do that all the time.
you told me I had to use the J.
Yeah.
Like, I would put the
They
pink
say
frames.
like they're telling me now that like I
So that when I am here,
child.
Yeah,
it doesn't turn into a large
Oh, I put this in.
I will get, because I copied the JS
It's like-
from
it's
the
like-
front
it's like-
page,
it's like-
I just correct the correct
It's all
the
campus.
here and
It's like 2 or 3 things.
So,
It's like, so like, look how it's you're saying,
oh, is that, and if I look at fade JS, fade button down on the panel.
sure, it's
Okay.
I mean, they're both examples.
That's what I don't know.
So, Jquery, you already
It's so funny because you're like, I don't know how to do it. It's like, that's good.
Sometimes sprints can take a lot longer.
Oh my god,
They're
it
like,
was.
wait a minute.
Yeah, so I'm real yeah.
That's modern. I hadn't broken anything. Yeah, and I broke my wrist. Yeah, but I kicked my. I forgot to close my functional wrist.
Kicking in, I just like went like this, and I fell so hard that I broke my wrist in a pile of rubber mats. Once before, but there's.
You can measure on.
I just like kept like getting files and stuff like that. And so when I copied the information, that's no,
So all.
Oh, that's fake, sorry.
Yeah, it's good that you guys take the part.
Well, I knew back from an every corner is 60.
Sorry, what? It actually, it was extremely long.
I was had to work my camera.
Taking into this one.
Oh, man.
Which
It was like-
well, I had nothing.
It was like
That's the same thing.
they were like,
The idea is.
you might not have like a
There should be.
your knuckle.
I'm thinking.
But there's a chance that if you push a knuckle down, it'll just like start falling over. And like, you won't wow. Yeah, it was like,
So you
it was
don't.
really bad.
So the goal is to make the range 1%.
And then.
Whatever the
That's the one that was researching.
And also, so you're starting at you're starting that's why it like goes there and it's like
You already gave it.
you don't even need to. So that's a very you can access. I broke my humor in 7 places.
That's not
right at all. Oh, 300, no, 300, yeah. Awesome.
To be on drugs and only 1 arm.
That's gonna go.
It's gonna go. So you could still like take notes.
No, sorry.
That would be if I could imagine one thing worse. It was if it was your right arm.
Oh, see, that's what I thought. Yeah, that's what I thought. So if it goes 300, yeah, so just put 0. Yeah.
See, I only broke 1 per finger. Except this one was 7 times. Yeah. Eyebrow, chin, my knee. Oh yeah, and my head. Yeah.
I did the same thing for my CSS. I did weird shit. You did do Keyframes. So yeah, when I made my whole position out there, I used it. So what you did was you used transform, which is
Okay, a wall.
You don't have to look at So when they, a lot of times when they do surgery, certain surgeries, they
oh, you did that? Oh, that's why I did it that way.
into your body. And if you don't manage it, then you get like swelling. You ever see somebody with like it's just like really and so I don't know how you do it. It's like switch get closer to
Well, so here's what happened. Like, I started having these horrible. Yeah, so yeah, it's the same thing we're doing. Animation.
I don't think so. Right now. We'll see.
This is
It worked. If you can do that for any of your people, I can use this now to do a scrap prototype. Yeah. I am so excited.
Stand up. And then my doctor is like, one side, perfectly normal. The other side,
yeah, slack me the link.
nothing. It's just completely okay.
So cool.
Experience
Well,
There it is.
Hey guys, I have a website.
And now,
Hey.
so
So we've got to re-onboard you. We just got to
Yeah.
write the contract, send
Okay.
it to you,
cool.
add you back in,
I figured that was probably
and
the
then I'll
case.
back. Yeah, that's exactly what it was.
Okay.
So I don't know if that was me or how it was supposed to work.
I know
so
like
I'm
Keyframes
sorry.
is going through like a whole bunch of changes. So
Yeah, they
I always get
are.
lost in
They
shuffle.
are, and like we're putting in like a whole new payroll process. So that's been like giving some issues. So I kind of
Yeah.
just assumed that's what it was.
Yeah, that's what my
I
assumption
didn't
too.
think it was a bigger underlying issue. So
Yeah.
Cher, who does all the onboarding, she like pinpointed who needed to do what
Okay.
and send you all the stuff. So
Cool.
I imagine it should be coming soon.
Cool.
So I'll follow up with them
Yeah.
tomorrow.
Yeah. As long as you keep me in the loop, I'm cool with
Yeah.
that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem.
We'll figure it out. I promise. I'll stay on top of them.
Appreciate it. Catch you later.
Yeah.
I don't know exactly what yet. I'll figure it out between now and Saturday. But
Right, like, there's math. This is SAS, not SAS.
I mean, I didn't have to like go down, you know, to the
So what I'm trying to do is give each individual
There's one over there.
yeah, you think better than this one?
It's like right there. Is that any closer?
So the thing that was wrong was missing the house.
No, thank you. Yeah. And I deleted. That was the 700. I think
I don't know what's up.
I could do just by
Old school.
traditional. Would you like to call it traditional?
Old school. My used to like to call it old school. Classic.
Classic.
I gotta learn how to do that.
It was so easy. If I could figure it out, you would figure it out. I'm telling
So
you.
you're gonna teach me too?
I'll teach
and
you.
I thought maybe I had to
Because it's the desktop version.
Oh, you didn't have to put like a terminal in
I
there?
actually a terminal. See, the terminal is weird. So I don't like it.
Yeah,
I'll change that one. Yeah, you're welcome.
That's apparently how
We're supposed to be having, today was scheduled at 3 o'clock for our kickoff, so I think I give up any time probably either before that, if you want to get settled in.
I want to say you don't have to be on this one.
Have you over a week dinner and then Mark,
Sure.
I can pick you up at like 5.
I don't know.
Down there.
So,
Or at 4:30.
Oh, cool.
But our kickoff's
I
at
think you're right.
3 and it might be about a little over an hour.
so I have to, here's my one
No,
sheet.
it's
I have to,
Break that down.
No, it's Saturday, second. I just did my kickoff.
Wait, so you're just portfolio?
Yeah, no, I did.
I was like, all right, I did
Slow
everything.
down.
And I opened it up in,
That's
on
next
the,
week's
on the
project.
browser.
No,
I clicked the
that's not
button,
WordPress.
Then my
Oh,
button.
I already did all that.
Still right.
Yeah, so it's gonna be like the regular typing.
I don't know if you heard me crack up. I did the button. I clicked the button and the
I
button
can see
delivered.
it, but I couldn't pick up.
Let's find out.
And then, I was just thinking that, like, I wonder how many.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there was something that I
Sweet.
Jquery.
I
I think there's like stuff
I
that
understand.
I went and I can't figure out how to get it sort of made to evolve, and then I want to customize stuff, and I'm trying to customize.
Yeah, we're done on this.
And I'm so proud of myself that I actually got my job.
Very similar to the notation I was showing you.
It's like when I look at this, and I look at the link, it shows me like that template. So I go back and I open the site.
Okay. If I can get everybody to sit down, let's get class back into gear and get this next exercise started. Cool. All right. No problem. Okay, so the next exercise we'll be working on is exercise 4. Hey, you guys quite finished over here? Yeah, let's try and get things started. Cool. So, our next exercise, we're going to be making a rainbow. And it's a little bit more interesting than it sounds. So, what we are going to do is when I refresh this page and click the button Make a Rainbow, it's an animation that seems to draw some colors on the screen and then fade away. Who wants to take a guess of what they're seeing right now? What animations are being triggered right now? Well, we know there's fade, but what is that? It's not called fade though. What's it called?
Oh, the loading thing.
No. There's another name for it. What were we just using in the previous exercise? Opacity. Or maybe is there another name? Or is there also a fade?
No, it's called opacity.
Okay, yeah. So it's opacity. That's what we're seeing. We're seeing the colors go from 0% to 100%, and then 100% to 0%. What else are we seeing? Transformations. We're seeing it do what? Transforming how? Correct, along the x-axis. And we know that is doing it over a duration of time. And there's two things that we've noticed. One, wait a second. Is it just one thing? Yeah, the opacity is just going from 0 to 100. So how many point in time animations do you think this would be? I'm going to ask for your rationale behind 5 and 3. So if you're making answers, have some justification. Why do you think 5? Okay, so the question is how many different animations, like with the keyframes, you notice how we could do it in point in time. We could have 25%, we could have 50%, we could have 100%. How many different animations are you seeing on the screen? 2? So we see 2 separate animations, but what else? Correct. So at least from what our guess would be, right? So we have 2 animations. We have opacity and we have transformation across the x-axis. But from what we've seen right now, this is our best guess from just looking at it, is that it's only really doing one thing. It's taking those 2 animations and doing them all at the same time throughout the duration of the animation. So, say what? So it would just be 1 keyframe at 100%. So we know that all we need is 1 keyframe at 100%. 2, we're going to need some background colors. 3, we're going to have to take that opacity all the way up to 100%, starting at 0. And then 3, we're going to need to transform across the x-axis for a certain number of pixels. So let's look at the code that you guys have. So you should open up exercise 4, the unsolved section. All right, and in this unsolved section, if you look at the HTML, we already provide you guys some hints. 1, we didn't add the reference to our CSS file, which would be the rainbow.css. What tag will we use for that? What tag do we make a reference to the CSS files that we use?
It's the link style.
Correct, it's the link tag. So we use a link tag to make a reference to our rainbow.css. Then, is telling us we need to add 7 divs. Each of them would have their own ID for the 7 colors of the rainbow. There was one slight bug with this particular exercise, so I'm going to change the creation order. So you're going to create the button first that triggers this event, make a rainbow first. Then you're going to add the 7 divs of the rainbow with their own unique IDs. So then after you're done with that, you also need to make sure that you make a reference to your JavaScript file, which is rainbow.js. This is just trying to get you guys in the habit of making sure that you have your link to your CSS files and your link to your JavaScript files. So nothing crazy with those two. But all you need is a button and then the 7 divs that you'll be playing around with in your jQuery. We already know that we've already done on-click events for buttons. So when we look at the JS file, you'll notice that you have no JavaScript in here because you already have all the boilerplate that you need. In the previous exercise, we made a reference to the button. We were able to add classes on click from that button function, and those are the class names that you're going to be adding to those 7 individual divs. So you're going to have 7 individual jQuery selectors for all of those divs that you have on your HTML page. And all you're going to do is add the class name that pertains to the color, that pertains to the animation that you're seeing over here. Now your CSS file is going to be a little bit more involved. You're going to need 7 different class names that denote the color of the rainbow. So each of them would have like red, what else? Yellow, green to start off with. And their opacity, as you can see when this begins, is 0. It will be in the keyframe that you increase the opacity to 100 because you're moving from 0 to 100. So those are a few tips for this particular exercise. We're going to do this for the next, we end class at 9:30. Let's do this until 9 o'clock. Because this should, if I notice that everyone is killing this very early, then we'll move on to the last exercise. Yeah, this should take a little bit of time.
Red, RGB.
Well, when in doubt, colors of the rainbow. Wasn't that a Pocahontas song? Colors of the Rainbow? Something like that.
Blue, indigo. Violet.
Yeah. There we go. Everything is just a Google search away. Sure, no problem. Mm-hmm. Whoops.
Right, so.
Oh, did I unplug you?
No, it's so this is what you see. Thanks.
Again, so my son got red, orange, yellow, green, it was up there. I guess that's the technical name. It's a word? What are you talking about? Red.
I'm just asking because it doesn't tell us.
That's what I don't understand. Why would they
That's what I did.
Red?
17.
I know, but then how do you, I don't understand. So it would be div pound.
Still, yeah.
Okay. Is that what you did? You just left yours blank. Why did you do yours blank? Yeah, okay, I get that.
Yes, because that's what's
So what I'm doing is I'm putting an ID for each. So we're gonna change the dash to
So these are gonna change?
Best practice should have been 90. It would have been equal to 20. But then later on, if I call something else yellow.
Okay, so over here they said to do dots.
Yeah, but instead of
It's
style,
the solve. I'm trying not to use solve, but I use it as a reference when I make a choice.
But you really
Dot, no. So then when I go back to here, this shouldn't be ID, this should be, and it just says class equals or class equals.
So you're starting a new CSS file.
the app that my CSS is working.
Oh, no.
Okay. Okay.
You're just being.
I just don't understand why you do one over the other.
But at least you're getting there, you got all your different tips and stuff. XML CSS, JavaScript has tags. That's why it's start each of these CSS classes are just doing that. Are you guys doing
Yes.
I'm still working on PhD.
okay.
First,
So why do you think
well, no, I was thinking of the CSS to the top and a recast.
And so this saw one. So that's why I'm not sure why I'm not. But I'll just keep doing it. But now I have to change my CSS to now.
Where are you going with keyframes?
So, like I did color HTML now. I created a class.
Let me just keep moving forward before I confuse myself.
You don't have to do anything.
Yeah, so the I'm thinking they just, I understand what you're saying, but I think I want it to stick with the solve. If the solve one's doing ID, then maybe I should stick with that. Oh, okay. So I can learn at least that as well, and I'm doing the right thing, maybe, I don't know. Okay.
Quick question. We did the CSS, and since the div is already predetermined to be 100 pixels, why wouldn't it show if we don't even not to click on it?
You're talking about this right here?
Yeah.
Well, the width is 0%.
Oh yeah. You're right.
So you're not going to see it on the screen.
You're not gonna see it.
Yep. It's your animation that increases that width.
Yeah, you're so right.
Yep.
It's just, you just don't.
Mine did nothing. Mine did nothing so far. Doesn't make a raise. No, I'm still ID.
Okay, finish that, save
I
it.
did first.
So name this something else.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
Because
Maybe it's something that makes sense, because you'll be so confused.
okay.
Because like I said, the div is already telling you. All anything that's on div is 100%. It's 150.
Yeah, I know. So dot rank needs to be added to all things. You need to know the time.
Could you make your wish around percent?
But when you click on, did you make your button already?
That's not squares. Yeah, exactly. You're a little bit further than I am. This.
Yeah, I'll let you go. You're rocking.
You sure it's because I did ID, it should be a dot, not a hashtag?
Oh.
So that's what I asked them.
Yeah, but I'm saying, should this be a dot?
I mean,
should be right there.
don't forget your width is 0.
I'm looking at that.
Because your animation is going to increase that sort of stuff. So yeah, so if you do that temporarily, it means it's there. You refresh the page, you should see it. Oh, you have to add pixels. Let's try this one.
Whatever, just be whatever you want.
She did relatives, so the only thing I don't have is relatives. So they gave us.
Let's see your CSS.
CSS.
Oh, well, you don't have a background. You don't have a background.
Where?
That's what you guys say.
Okay.
Oh my god, like we're forgetting that.
That would definitely be key.
Yeah. This is like teaching an old dog new tricks, man. It's so painful for everybody.
We use pound.
And are these words
might
like
even be
orange
you
and
know,
violet
circle
and
around
all
these
that
guys. They're gonna
stuff?
solve the same stuff you're trying to solve.
She's really good. Don't ask me.
So,
It doesn't matter what you call it, right? You can call it anything.
Whatever you want.
You should sit in George. She's like, very sure. That helped.
just confident I've done something wrong thus far. So right now I'm going in, I'm gonna finish out my colors here. And then I have to do the image. But I only have to do just one animation, one I did that answer earlier. Okay. And then I'll do my best one. But it's, this is fine. Right?
Yeah, that's what you're doing.
Okay, so I'm gonna finish my colors. We have more time than.
Yeah.
Yeah, it goes into stuff.
Yeah. It's just not yeah, you can do that for variable names.
Should I change my name? Lord have mercy.
Keep the ID name, but just make it, just remove that hyphen.
Yeah, here's my CSS. So here's my CSS. Oh no, my divs were all named. I did divs or class.
Yeah,
And then if you did a div or a class depending, you change this and you do the same names that you gave the div tags or the tags here. Yeah. She just did box because that was her div and her CSS also says box 1, box 2. Sure. div, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, instead of class, or you could do class. And then I did, because I did div, I did pound, because you do class, you can do a dot.
So this
And
relationship.
name it the same thing, these are divs.
And you haven't done it yet.
And then give it some things, as well as background color will show up. And the same background color should be the same. Well, it should be the color you want. That's why I'm just doing it intuitive. I'm just doing it intuitively. She's called them boxes, and she's choosing which color goes in what box. But I just wanted to visually be able to know that I always want it to be in this order. You know. Yeah. And then did you move your button code above the div code? Did you make your button ID make rainbow? So in your HTML, that was one of the things he said there was a glitch. You're supposed to see the button code. You have to put it in yet. That'll actually go up to the div. So that fixes, yeah. And it's the button ID, so we do the carrot. And they call it button here, space ID equals, whatever you want to call it, whatever the ID name is, then close it, call it make a rainbow, because that's the name of the button at the top, so it says make a rainbow. And then end it, and that should fill in your code for you, so that button's code.
So you're doing a lot of, it's because you copy
Now
code from failure, so you're doing a lot of things that you don't commonly find.
Rainbow below it.
You're adding something to box.
Now I'm gonna figure out how to make it stretch by making keyframes. Okay. So, actually,
You named it that, so.
where would we find typical language for a keyframe?
Oh, your previous exercise. Well, you used a keyframe in your previous exercise. You could just see how that was built.
So,
The ball exercise.
But I don't need to do it.
I could call anything I want, right?
Call it whatever you want.
So if I wanted it to be called speed animation, if I wanted to.
Yep.
Or stretch animation, stretch.
Yep. The name is unique. Whatever you feel like makes sense.
That's where I get lost as to what's unique and what is got to be what language they use.
Oh, like a special CSS name or a special JavaScript name.
As to when I create the wording and when, unless it automatically propagates from which Sublime doesn't.
Sure. Yeah. That's definitely going to be something you're just going to have to deal with like over time. Like eventually it'll start making sense as you use these functions and these key names over and over again. You'll be able to tell the differences
Know
between
what is language and what is
something you have to make up.
yeah,
Yeah,
what is more unique.
correct. That's just practice.
Alright, so
You look like you had a question though? What's that? Did you have a question?
No,
That worked
kinda
out?
had a similar.
Okay.
That's why I was just,
Oh, I see.
yeah,
Got
I
it.
don't know, like sometimes when they're made up.
Yeah.
yeah, it's so
That's
confusing
confusing.
sometimes.
Yeah, so
Get that
I know
wrong.
like Dreamweaver and sometimes helps with autocomplete, I think. And Sublime Text has some plugins that can help with that, but it's really just practice. Yeah.
Again, that's when I get lost. It's like when you do a space and when you do quotes. When you add quotes. You know, you and I are the same page on all of that.
So we've established that one as this state. So this we're establishing as this
Ten more minutes.
No, you didn't. Put it on the projector. On the projector. Watch Alex do it. Alex.
I know I'm not supposed to look, but I tried guessing the solve just to see, just to get a glimpse to see if I'm going in the right direction. So when I look at the solve,
I realize you're doing it.
okay, I typed them all in. I don't get the here, and I wanted to.
It helps me. It helps me.
She told me to do it.
So there's two different ways to do this. One, you're initializing your boxes that already have your colors.
But I thought pound sign was
All the
for
different classes. So you're going to now be on class names. It's going to change.
because if I just choose all the dots, doesn't that do the same thing?
No. So CSS has two different ways. Now so if you look, it's better than being I don't want to create a class name. And then you're going to use the animation key as reference.
That's true. Yeah, I wrote they're not showing stuff I did. It just went straight for animation. They want to understand why I had to work. And then I started out that have dot.
So remember how I said JavaScript?
I was like in the library in college.
That's exactly what you're saying. You just visualize the colors first, and then now you can create your class. This is a perfectly valid way to do it. Just a solution is doing this.
Okay.
But instead, the solution is they're just creating the class names immediately and doing the animation in two separate keyframes. They have a keyframe called stretch that just increases the box.
And I just created one I was going to call page stretch, and I haven't given it.
Correct.
And I would start now doing a dot.
I did correct.
Right. And then I have to do. And then I have to put the animation comes up, and then I would do fade.
So let's do that. That's it.
entirely of 10 seconds.
Hold on, so it's fine with this, right?
I believe it's
Do we do another
right,
variable?
and the program started new program.
So variable, yeah, so variable
That
is not.
you have the what am I using? I'm doing with 100%. And in mine, I'm just adding the background color red, which you already have the background color. So all you need is just the width.
And is it colon or equal?
We didn't finish that before we did that. No, we didn't. We just did it.
100%? And do I do a thingy after it?
All we did.
And then
Actually, yeah, let's do that.
And then you said, I think that's it. That's it.
save. If I would go to my HTML.
Oh, nice.
So now
Okay. So,
It's there.
just like in the previous section, separate.
Think of this. Yeah, that's exciting.
That's no good.
This is craziness. We're not trying to
Look at the old one, just the one that's solved,
I'll come
and
back.
then try to try to make sense of it. Solve, yes, it's a quick function off.
Got like 3 more minutes and then we'll take a look at the solution.
Let me just change it to end it. Are you trying to get alright? So,
Trying to figure out.
this is the hard part. Also, yeah. So, but let's. I'm really gonna know you sure.
Did you put in your, did you put in this guy? Above all you did? That's the thing
Right,
about
I
calling,
just copy this here.
to have action. It's that button that says make a rainbow that has a
So
action.
here's the CSS codes, the CSS boxes are created. So I was HTML forms, stripes.
Oh,
So
really?
they're saying make a rainbow box. Here's the call, is the click function to then do what you want to do, which is to add the classes.
So,
I mean, best practices, no, because you have so much more going on and there's so many different.
best practice is to give all of them this single class.
So we have to remember the click function is to that box. Oh, so then the top box.
Make a rainbow.
Change it to whatever you call it.
Oh, so
Oh,
that's
I
just
get
right.
it. So let's create a variable.
So that's your tiny box at the top of the folder.
That is my that's right.
There
there's
we
multiple
go.
keyframes.
She got it.
So we can do the one
You can look at her.
Only one?
I'm excited.
You can do one, you can do them all.
You're look at all
I'm doing something.
Well, just like, no, you just gotta do it like the other one did. Just open up the solved again and look at it, and they just did it.
So, and then, so here.
I'll walk through the solution now.
Yes.
Okay, so before we start our final activity for the class, I wanted to walk through 2 separate solutions. Cool. So if I could just get everybody's attention, we'll walk through 2 different solutions for this exercise. Because I want you guys to realize that there's 100 different ways to do this particular exercise. And all of them could be considered valid. Just because the solution doesn't match what you have in your files does not mean that you're going in the wrong direction. So to start off, I'm just going to do one quick solution with one of the pieces of the rainbow. I created my button with the button ID make a rainbow. I created my individual div with the ID red, and then in my JavaScript, I'm saying for when the make rainbow is clicked on, for that specific button, I'm going to add the class red. Now, in this scenario, I could have also had this multiple times for yellow, for black, for whatever. It doesn't really matter. It's just saying for that one on-click event, it's going to select all of my individual divs and add the class that I have in my CSS.
Question.
Can you show us like the HTML first to see how everything's connected?
Sure.
Because right now, like, I don't know how you call anything, so I don't know what's what.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll go over this again. So,
I'm sorry.
no problem. So, as I mentioned earlier, you need a link to your CSS in the head. You need a link to your JavaScript, or nothing will work. Second, you need a button on the page to play with. This button needs an on-click event, which is the make a rainbow button over here. Secondly, you need a div on the page to play with. This is the div I'm now going to add red to. This is the div I'm going to add animation to. So I created a simple div with the ID red. In my JavaScript, I need to play with this red div, because this is the div I'm doing my animations with. With this red selected over here, I'm going to add a CSS class red on the back end, which is going to now initiate my animation. This is done using an on-click event for the make a rainbow button. Remember, we're using the click helper function. Before, we were using on. This is just to show you that there's multiple different ways to do the exact same thing. So when the button is clicked, it's going to add the red class to my red div that's over here that you don't see, and it's going to trigger some kind of type of animation. Animation all lives in the CSS. Now it's the CSS portion that can be done a multitude of different ways. But I decided to go with the simplest approach, which was I have a red class that uses the animation key for a keyframe that I created called red stuff. And then I added a duration of 5 seconds. And then that red stuff keyframe at the bottom for the entirety of the 5 seconds. I wanted to increase the width from 0%, which is started off. Don't forget, this says for all the divs on the page, they're going to be of height 100 pixels, but the width is going to be 0%. That's why you don't see it on the screen. It's my animation that during the entirety of the 5 seconds is going to increase the width 100%, and then it's going to also include a background color of red. So when I click the button, it's going to add the red class, and then it's going to increase my div 100% of the screen. Now, I didn't have to do that. I could have also included a signifier for red, where I say background color red, and this will do the exact same stuff.
I did that in the CSS, the background color.
The background color?
Yeah, is that not right?
That's perfectly fine. But you'll notice that there's a difference with the animation. Now, when I refresh the page, this is already a solid red block that goes across the screen. That's because the red color has already been defined on the div. But because it's in the animation, you'll see it's gradually turning into red because it's doing that across the duration of the 5 seconds. So when I refresh the page, you'll see it slowly becoming a solid red instead of starting off a solid red. That's where the power of the animation comes into play, because you're saying across the duration of this time, I want you to do all this stuff that you see over here. I want you to turn this div into the color red across 5 seconds. I want you to increase the width 100% across 5 seconds, 100% of the time of those 5 seconds. So questions on this very simple example before I go to the more complicated example in your solutions? Yes. Don't forget, you can name this whatever you want. Red stuff, red stripe, red, I don't know. It doesn't really matter. This is your time to be unique with what you understand this animation is going to do.
Where's your transform? Where did you tell it?
Width 100%. Because in the beginning, it started off with a width of 0%. Yep.
But we could have put a transform thing there?
You would get a different animation. Depends on what you're trying to do. If you wanted to move the entire box, sure. But in this case, that's not what we want to do. Making sense? Cool. All right, so now let's take a look at the more complicated solution that you have in your activity. For the rainbow HTML, of course, they have the button that we spoke about earlier, the make a rainbow button, and then they have all 7 divs that pertain to the colors of the rainbow with their own individual IDs. and then of course the links to Rainbow.js and the link to Rainbow CSS. We'll start with the JavaScript first because that's more simple. In this solution, they have a on-click event for the button that when the button is clicked, it selects each individual button and adds the class that pertains to that color 7 times. So just copy and paste over and over again for each individual div. And then of course, remove the class name when the animation has ended. Keep in mind, this is doing it for the selector div with no pound sign and no dot notation. That means for all the divs on the page, they're going to have this animation end event attached to it. That might be a little new. I'm not so sure if I talked about that. But if you don't have a pound sign and you don't have a dot, then it's just going to look for any div tag on the HTML page and attach this event to it. It's just like a shortcut. And then the CSS, which is really the most verbose for this particular activity. They're of course starting all the divs off. Same concept as the div selector, where if you just have div, it's going to work on all the divs. In CSS, if you just have div over here with no pound sign and no dot notation, it's going to initiate this height 100 pixels and width 0% for all the divs on the page. That's what's happening.
Could you, like, I added a class to the div that encloses all the different boxes, and I used that class over there to define its height and width.
You could have done that too.
That's okay.
Many different ways to do this.
Okay, I mean, it didn't work.
So the route they took for this solution is they have 7 different classes for each individual color, and this is going to be some new syntax you see over here. So this is the same animation key that points to your keyframes, except they have broken this logic out into 2 individual keyframes. You don't have to do that, but this is an option that is available to you. You'll notice in my simple solution, I just did width 100% and background color all in the same keyframe. They just broke it out into 2 separate ones. Don't let that confuse you. So they have one that stretches, increases the width to 100%, and then they have red stripe, which I think just attaches a color. So let's scroll down. What is stretch doing? Stretch 100% of the duration, increases the width 100%. Simple. Red stripe, 50% of the time is going to turn the background color into red. I don't know why they chose 50%. I have to rewatch the animation to understand what's going on. So let's do that. It fades in and fades out?
Fades out. It's got like almost 2. See, it goes, fades in, and then
Okay, there you go. Cool. That makes a lot of sense. So 50% of that duration is going to actually have color and is going to fade away. So that's what they decided to do for this particular scenario. And that is about it. Questions on the more complicated solution? Yeah. Cool. So if you definitely take a look at this when you guys get home. Make sure you understand it, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask us on Slack. So now for the final activity, it was probably the hardest activity. So don't be too mad if you don't get a chance to finish it. But it's going to be called Pac-Man, and let me show you what that looks like. We're going to have a Pac-Man on the screen, just like the old school video game. When we click on, I think anywhere on the screen actually. Nope, not anywhere on the screen. When we actually click Pac-Man, he's going to move across the screen and do some stuff. He didn't follow anything. You know, Pac-Man does his own thing. So what? he's living his best life. I don't need to follow the rules. So what do we see right now? What are the animations we see? Who wants to round them off? There's an on-click event, specifically on Pac-Man. What else? Is his mouth actually moving? Oh, there we go. All right, so the image is changing. I don't even think that's a transform. I just think that's different images being displayed on the screen. I'll double check. But what else is going on? He's moving across the y-axis, and he's moving up and down randomly. So you don't have to follow the maze. You just need to move Pac-Man across the screen and do some ups and downs and call it a day. Let's see what's available to you. So if you look at your unsolved section, you have access to the map. If you look at your HTML, it's just going to be a big HTML, a big image tag with some divs, one for Pac-Man, and then references to your JavaScript and your CSS. In the unsolved CSS is already going to give you with a bunch of starter code. That starter code is going to load Pac-Man on the screen, I believe. So let's load this particular file. There we go. It loads Pac-Man on the screen. Don't need to build that part. He's gonna be. Oh wow! They didn't even use images. They just actually built a solid border and just created Pac-Man. All right. You're gonna have to figure that out. You're gonna have to do some kind of type of border changes and transformations and all that stuff. But I believe in you. Then you're gonna have your run class over here that has references to keyframes, byte, and a keyframe run maze. Byte is going to run for infinity, and that's what we can imagine is the mouth moving up and down. And then the maze run, which is going to go on for 4 seconds, which is Pac-Man actually going across the screen, as we saw earlier. So if we scroll down in the CSS, we have a keyframe for run maze, which is already created for you, and that has a transform already defined. But of course, you're going to have to add more to it as he moves across the screen. And they have already done the byte transformation, the byte keyframe for you. So you don't have to worry about byte, which is good, because that's probably looks like the hardest part of this exercise. So it is doing some strange stuff, starting at 50%, changing the different pixels, and 51, got some other pixels, and 99. But you guys can look at that later. So right now, it seems like what you guys really care about is the JavaScript. That would be grabbing the Pac-Man objects, attaching it on. No, this is easy because you already have most of the CSS already written for you.
I'm so close.
If you want to continue on the rainbow, feel free. Go right ahead. So let's make this an optional exercise. If you have time, start the Pac-Man one. It'll be a good experience if you've already finished the rainbow. If you haven't finished the rainbow, you can do that to the end of class. Let's do that. Sure.
Oh, there you go. Oh, that's because you're saying over here for all divs, add that class, which works. So
Yeah.
correct. Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah. Hey, if it works, it works.
I'm so impressed.
Yeah. Until you change that. Hundred different ways to do the exact same thing. Yeah. Sure.
Why isn't it working? I mean, don't be mad. It's really bad. I thought that was right.
Sure.
You just said it was a mess, but then you said it was technical, so I had to be sure.
So they're starting off with your numbers. That's fine.
Right. So we created a button, and then we created a bunch of divs for each stripe, and then made your easy results for each. So, regular transition, and then animation, stretch 4 seconds. Then my keyframes, stretch again with 1 motion.
Okay, so the class we're going to add to your divs is going to be right.
Yes.
Cool. This is your job.
Alright.
Alright.
So, your variable stripes, there, class stripes, and then we added a function to it that when you, well, so if you wanted to add the class variable position to stripes, and then we put it into so make a rainbows is a class. Yes. And then click on it, it goes to the scrambler position.
So now single transition doesn't actually exist. I guess I see.
And also we have to create a variable.
Oh, which one passes that function as a single transition? So you want to pass this
When I saw it, I felt like George cut it off.
Two.
the function stripes.
Function stripes because we created a variable with stripes to like add the function. I thought there was none, and then when I saw the website, I was like,
So the problem here was that you were attaching it to a button with function stripes are set up right because you
I didn't find the
function
information.
stripes adds
Oh,
I couldn't see
we
it.
were referencing how much. Then
Yeah.
that's the only thing
Right there inside.
No rainbow removed. Yeah, I mean, you did this one correct. Now let's see if this is zero.
There is no.
Yeah, you were passing in the code. So
So
something
we
else
start
going on.
moving.
What would it help out?
Let's take a look at this now again.
Well, it just was asking.
Oh, yeah, it's not. If there's like a complicated interaction,
Class to each
then
of
you
you.
would need it. But
I don't think we need
there's
I think
one
our scoring
sufficient.
on some of it can be an NA because it's not.
Like, we have a search bar.
Yeah, they must search marks.
But still, we're gonna need these things.
Oh, they will,
Every if that's their, yeah.
Because before we were selecting the class name stripes, it's just getting that parent to score.
I don't know.
Alright, so should I
We don't know if they
this
can
one?
just get it.
Okay.
This is all subjective.
when you start to care about this, right? I'm gonna look at some videos. I think I have a lot of
So now we're getting all of our individual
I was thinking that the graphic was
all the
equally
stripes.
match
Class,
Yeah, it's like, it's chunks of.
So that breaks it down step by step.
it's not actually attaching
Each
statistic, no transitions.
but that would just be
Oh, really?
So I did the next one is a video, and then the two ones are background. The drop box.
There's the first video. Oh, I didn't look at that. I was talking about the website. This is the only video I searched was on the website.
Oh, I watched the video she said.
Type in dollar sign stripes.
That's not on the
I saw
website.
that
That's
Google
heuristic
Drive.
is about our website.
Oh, I just
Oh, okay.
I was like, like,
Yeah.
Okay, so that's gonna give us 7 individuals. So that's correct.
this tobacco taxes.
It's not gonna be functional. So.
oh, yeah, so there is
So it was Tuesday, July 24th, at 10 p.m.
I know,
So it was response to
Oh,
Clara's
here.
email.
Pound sign.
Oh, no, you can't.
The same artist though, it's like, just different
Okay, so now we see it's adding the class correctly. So now,
just a score, since you have to go, there's one check mark in the box.
cool. I mean, it's always a little something. So.
I read through
Good
it.
job, though.
and-
Well, most of it, yeah.
Most of it,
Yeah.
No, but this is
Stay
how
together
George
for
and I
these
did
decisions.
research.
Alright.
Well, no, it's for a baseline.
Yes.
It's for a big baseline.
So why do you want to take that out?
Does this.
Like what is it?
Yeah.
Alright, it doesn't work.
The usability of just like sort of watching.
Anywhere it's not applicable to anything, it should be pretty easy. We've got enough notes in here that we can read through.
Does anybody need any help with anything in the last like 7 minutes of class? Cool.
So weighing out of five, this is going on the other side, right? On the bottom. No, right here, there's oh, yeah.
45
Yeah.
minutes was it?
Go to the second.
No, it was a while ago. I started.
Oh, it's just on the usability guidelines, it was the features, functionality.
But then also, you see where I have my like class.
So you go to the tab over and it should be, so, what do you want to score, does it meet?
So what were you trying to do in the start?
Broadly does.
I was trying to
Every
like,
jar.
four. I was trying to
I'm comfortable with a four. Like,
Somebody else is so yeah, so it doesn't work when I have it only in here. It only works when
See,
you have
same.
it on the actual things.
No, that's the
That's the
overall.
overall score.
That's the
We
net
add
score.
up all our numbers. We put the
It's
numbers
rating
in
out of 5.
out of five, 1 out of 5.
Right, 1 out of 5 over here.
So you're saying this is.
So we need to put a number in
Yeah,
there.
no, I can do that. Well, because, but because what's
Right now it's a
there, so
5,
what's
leaving it as a 5 or are we going to move to a 4? 4. 4? Because it's pretty good, right? I don't know why it's gray and I don't know why I understand that. George, are you in it? You in? Okay. There we go. And it was white, now you're in it.
Yeah, okay.
Every time someone's in it, it turns gray.
Okay, great.
Okay, alright, so whoever's typing, let's type.
No, you check.
Okay, so features and functionality support users' desired workflows.
There already was these options.
Oh,
We just take those out. That was just random ones that were in there, so we need our own numbers added. Supports desired workflow, I don't really know what the
There's
desired
some,
workflow.
there's some content that's missing, there's some pages in there, so.
I was sort of thinking of three also.
This was after this, I joined the work.
I can leave it 4 as well. Next one, users are.
Yeah, but I didn't.
But only your right is showing that too, yeah?
Yeah, because I
It's
said
an
the
NA.
application to just to name it.
How the tutors, how.
You know, I'm putting it in the wrong spot.
In draw.
But so it isn't because it reads funny. This versus the other thing.
It has nothing to do with it.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy.
You can change the weighting ratios. Weighted.
So yeah, like just for success. Color, size,
So it takes a lot.
yeah. It's a lot of yeah, people do crazy stuff. So, so like that's all CSS, and the reason that people versus like just text is a lot more. Yeah, so it's actually like
It's not a
you can also use this
I can still put a job title.
yeah.
So
And the way they do it is set explicit, so it's absolutely in your explicit. Change the position, and two sets. Very specific for the so like, yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Right. Well, I mean, like
it's pretty straightforward.
exactly. You can only make a circle with one. So if I like change that, it's your change.
No, I'm gonna go search for sure. They need to be clear.
Yeah,
about
but I mean, you should do like.
watch our video. There's your friend. It's about the book, but he doesn't say. This is where it's
Every single thing is explicit, like absolutely.
correlation between the price of tobacco.
Exactly.
You guys do?
Yeah, dig a little bit, yeah, okay.
It's not on the
I'm trying to do working on Pac-Man.
I'm easily oriented when I'm
But I'm not quite there yet.
It looks like that.
like I sort of see where.
Yeah, but it's not like really. Trying to. Yeah.
Well, you should have. Well, no, that's
I know.
He's not even in town.
Yeah. Without a
He's
client.
not even in town.
Yeah, so he told us that, so he sent us a separate email. But he sent us a separate email, he was just like, here's a conference call number, okay, and so we'll be on it. So I think he will be.
That's a pretty good score. I don't think it's
Conference call.
and maybe it is a
It
five.
would be in the same room.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping, I kind of suggested that maybe we do a conference call instead. So our mix is gonna be in. I gave him a conference call number, but he didn't respond to that either, so. If we wanna do Skype, I can send him the Skype stuff too, cause we're open years ago.
It's fine if we have the conference, number, because that's probably what we're gonna do.
They're not gonna be together,
Sure.
That's
if we're
This is
talking.
an NA, that's
just
fine.
alone and we can see him on
It's
Skype, but
so if you're browsing like Amazon,
I mean, we can
average rating.
I'm just saying that there's gonna be
That's not a
some
functionality.
people that are only gonna see one, and there's gonna be other people that are gonna see
Can we do 12?
Do you want me to send you the presentation, like, I mean, at this point, I don't know. Yeah, I've already, there's one 100%. I've already given him it all.
Is he gonna be like?
Four.
No,
Four.
There's
nothing, and I felt like it was really.
So Ramon is going right now. It's early next week.
So you're number 13, right?
Yeah. Who cares? It doesn't matter.
Well, I just want to know who the real
No, no, no. Oh, no, you're right.
I'm saying, like, but Jorge is the point of contact for sure. Like the main point.
Yeah, I was confused sometimes because I thought some of the box elements were supposed to be linked, and they put that box kind of behind things. I think that's kind of not, well, we already have our last function, I think it's.
Still just ready to.
Website's not working.
We need to have
The breadcrumbs.
Oh.
Put them with the
There's an active state.
So there's an active state, so should be a 5, or should you take the notes out?
Here, what I call
Even though there's notes that say the breadcrumbs, the navigation bar indicates that the page you're on.
Yeah.
So that means it's a breadcrumbs So 5 is fine, because
No, it is
visually,
Your
it's
ad,
navigation.
this doesn't have to be anywhere else. Oh, that's what, that's what.
17,
I do
16.
that, and then I
But I
come
had just
here,
copied it.
and I have that class, so I can see it, right?
Easily back to, I don't know, I just thought that one was just sort of like launched a whole new page.
Yeah.
Alright, so 5.
We're looking at kickoff notes and
There's one that says client, and
Yeah.
so that's where we're gonna put all the client.
You put no site map index. It's not a robust site one, but I did go to that website where you can sort of look at all the different URL. It breaks down into
I'm still
URLs.
looking at overview of scope.
Wanted to do an index site map for everything, but it did show you how to put that up.
They have on
How many links are attached for pages are attached to that site?
Someone was very proud of their site map. Just like, I'm gonna give some top level market review.
So with the 3 to 4 split models, that is, so we're not that much.
No, sorry, this is just. I just.
The idea of this is also.
I just added that because I wanted to say like I didn't know that I had to do it at the college.
How long was for it?
They are.
But then being like, what do you want to pick?
Is it not applicable for any?
But with the other kind of mid-range.
But we see,
I mean, it's well structured in the sense that I think that the hierarchy
let's see
of
what
the site map.
So you're saying this, you're saying that client don't have those.
Should we give it a 5 or do we just give it a 0 for not?
That was the idea, but we didn't end up having one there.
Right. And it was like, there's like a required baseline of like these certain things, and it's like, here's like this.
18, consistent, easy
Yeah.
to find, easy
Because I
to
guess
search
also
function, not algorithm again. These
These
are all zeros, right?
Cool.
The
Thanks, man.
Public search is 0.
Thank you, sir.
So I guess like, if they didn't.
Sorry, we had to, our one teammate had to leave, and we had to discuss why we did not project, I'm sorry.
Ah.
I feel bad that we didn't continue with the rainbow. I know, but she had to leave right in class. Yeah.
But yeah, so class is over, everyone. I think everyone did a pretty good job today. This was kind of it started off challenging because we didn't know what a keyframe was. I didn't know what a keyframe was, but we figured it out and we persevered, and so we made it through. So good job. Good job.
And I just made up.